most interesting relationships I made back at the school, back at the seminary, with a group of 3 seminarians from Kenya. It turns out that the Orthodox Church in Kenya is a thriving, vibrant institution. And these men were Father Evangelism, who we became the closest with, Father Makarios, and Father Anastasios. And so during our first year at the seminary, before Matthias came along, when it was just Presbyter and I, we invited them over to our house for lunch. Now, oddly enough, they had already done seminary training and been ordained back in Kenya. They were coming to us for further study, so they were already priests. And I served them a very traditional meal. I made arroz con habichuelas con camarón. That's rice and beans with shrimp. We made yuca fritters and a few other things, just traditional Latin food. And I'll never forget the look on their face. At first when I said, oh, this is yuca. And they, yuca. I don't have another word for it. And they tried one, and they're like, cassava. I'm like, okay, that's what you call it. Fine, that's what we call it. And they were excited. And as soon as we served the place, they said to me, this is African food. I said, Puerto Rican food, okay. And they were just shocked and very much made at home by how similar our culture and our food was to theirs. It turns out that about a generation or so ago, a very enterprising bishop from the Greek Orthodox See of Alexandria, who was placed over that territory, Archbishop Makarios, decided that he wanted to make it a priority to missionize and evangelize the Kenyan people, not just set up diaspora churches. And so, And so, what he did was he began to engage the local tribes. And so he translated all of the documents into the local languages. He began ordaining local native clergy. And so you see the Orthodox Church in Kenya, the worship is either in mainly Kikuyu or in Swahili. You're going to see Kenyan priests. In fact, all 3 of them were Kenyan. I know Father Evangelos was a Kikuyu tribesman specifically. And so what I was fascinated by was this interplay between the faith and culture. This interplay between the missionary experience. And since this had happened a generation before, and Father Evangelos was maybe about 2 or 3 years older than myself, it had happened in his grandparents' or his parents' time. And so he grew up as a Kikuyu tribesman in the Greek Orthodox Church. He's a cradle. But it's just close enough back that we can observe what happens in Orthodox mission when it goes right. And so I sat down, I talked with them, and I was very interested because I have my own culture that comes into the mix. I mean, what do you do with the fact that you're a Puerto Rican priest in the Greek Orthodox Church with a Peruvian presbytera? All of these cultures soup together, they touch, and the question becomes, how do we speak to the culture, in our case, that we come from? And how do we speak, in all of our case, to the culture in which we're at? And that is specifically the task of missions. So let's talk for a second a little bit about how that's occurred in the past. What does that look like? To do that, I want to make a very clear distinction. Most of the time, when people hear the term mission work, and when you bring up mission work, many Orthodox Christians will say, well, we don't proselytize. And they're putting these 2 words together, evangelization and proselytization. And the problem is they're not the same thing. They're right. The Orthodox Church doesn't proselytize. But they're wrong. The Orthodox Church does evangelize and has historically had a great many missions. Think about it. The church didn't spontaneously just appear in Russia, didn't spontaneously just appear in Serbia or Romania, didn't spontaneously appear in Greece. The book of Acts records it arriving there with the Apostle Paul, but it didn't just appear one day out of thin air. We've constantly been doing this. So the difference between these 2 words is this. Proselytization typically involves some form of coercion, some form of manipulation or force. You know, I'd really love to give you aid, and I can give you this, But you know, if you joined our church, I could do so much more for you. Or sometimes even force, the threat of force, closing down institutions, force from a social political structure. That's proselytization. That's exactly the Orthodox problem with proselytization. It involves coercion. Missionary work and missionary efforts, evangelization, involves contact with and reaching the culture, baptizing what can be baptized, and a dialogue. And the problem with this, it is messy, and it takes years and years and years. So, I said it's messy. There have been historically two different schools of thought when it comes to Orthodox mission work. And they're represented by two ancient thinkers. The first is St. Justin Martyr. He lived around 125 AD. He was a philosopher who was converted to Christianity because he saw the men and women and children dying in the arena, and they weren't afraid. He saw women and children face down beasts in the Colosseum and go to their deaths bravely and with prayer. And he said famously, these Christians have something different about them. They don't live or die like other men. And he asked, what do they have? So he went and he searched it out and he found it. And as his name implies, he ended his life as a martyr. His writings tell us more about the early church than most other figures. And he is famously the one who said, and I am paraphrasing here because it's a long quote, to those who spoke according to the reason that was given to them, though they came before Christ, when speaking truly, are yet called Christians, for they spoke according to reason, logos. And then he goes on to name them: Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Pythagoras, Hermes Trismegistus, and many others. He names this long list, and he calls them Christians before Christ, and even says, anything that was said truly and spoken rightly among men is the property of us Christians. And that was the way he approached looking at philosophy in his day, because let's remember, that was not neutral intellectual space. That was very pagan ground. He didn't flee from it. He said, what's true? What can I use? What can't I? And the man died a martyr and a saint. He wasn't about to compromise. Brilliant writer. A century or so later, we have another writer by the name of Tertullian. Now, here's a problem. Once you start to get a century or two later, Western Europe is already losing its touch with the Greek language that the early patristic writings were written in. And it had already lost Syriac, which the earliest writings were written in. And Latin had become the common form of speech, and there were very few prominent Latin writers. And so the few that exist sort of rise to the top and become very influential. That's one of the reasons Augustine of Hippo is so popular in the Catholic Church and barely talked about in the Orthodox Church. He wasn't quite a blip on our radar screen. We weren't reading Latin, and we had other large theologians that were more significant to us. Another writer by the name of Tertullian comes into play here, and he was the first major writer in Latin. He was a convert later in life, and he was a lawyer by trade. And Latin is a language that lends itself very well to the study of law. It's very juridical. So as you might imagine, Tertullian was a very black and white legal kind of guy. And he summed up, in Latin also tends to be very succinct and to the point. And he summed up his view of missions by saying, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? He was a hardliner. You might have also noticed that I didn't call him Saint Tertullian. He died outside of the church. He was so much of a hardliner that he joined a sect called the Montanists. The Montanists were a very interesting sect. They gave themselves very much to spontaneous prophetic utterances, and the founder of the sect, claimed that his wife was the Holy Spirit, and she would have these utterances and everything. But what attracted them to that sect was the church was preaching that after baptism, you could still repent. Well, the law says one baptism for remission of sins, and any sin after baptism must not be forgivable. The church is getting too liberal, too lenient. I'm going to join this sect. The church was not being strict enough for Tertullian. That's why he left. He died outside. He died a heretic. Nevertheless, his writings remain influential because no one else was writing in Latin at the time. While we praise St. Justin Martyr sort of for his wide view, very often in practice we end up sounding a lot more like Tertullian. Very often in practice, when it comes to engaging the world around us, we take a tack that's a little bit more like Tertullian, who again died outside of the church. So what does Orthodox mission look like when it goes right? These sorts of problems weren't going away. So we fast forward a little bit later. St. John Chrysostom, St. Basil come on the scene. Christianity has become a force. But guess what? All of the learning is still pagan. All of the schools are still steeped in the pagan gods. And this is where St. Basil comes and says something that is radically controversial. Controversial for his time. This is where he instructs the young men in their learning. And he says, they said, how do we approach pagan learning? He said, be like the bee. The bee goes from flower to flower, taking the pollen, taking the things it needs, and leaving the rest. Imitate that. Go into the academy, take what's true, say Justin Martyr, take what's true, take what's good, leave the rest. It's also worth noting that a classmate of St. Basil the Great in that endeavor was Julian the Apostate, one of the last great persecutors of the Christian faith. They were classmates under the same professor. So they came to two very different conclusions about the type of learning. Nevertheless, Plato, Aristotle, we don't think about these things as controversial. At the time, there could not have been more of a pagan subject. And because this progress has gone underway in us so long, I was at the monastery of Iviron on Mount Athos, and I got a little book, and it was called From Heraclitus to Elder Porphyrius. And Elder Porphyrius now recognized as Saint Porphyrius since then. And the monk, he made a connection between what Heraclitus the philosopher saw in shadow, in seed form, what we call in theology spermatiki logi, the seeds of logic, the seeds of truth in everything, also mentioned by Augustine. And then what would come to full flowering in the gospel and be transmitted through Porphyrius, and he makes a connection. We don't find anything strange about that. But that's partially because this process has been underway within Greek culture for so long. What can be baptized has been baptized. What can be embraced has been embraced. But at the time when that's undergoing its process, it's very rocky. So as we start to look and say, well, enculturation means among the Greeks there's going to be a Greek flavor. Among the Russians there's going to be a very Russian flavor. Here we are in America. We have to engage the culture that we're in so that there's a local flavor to our orthodoxy. It doesn't mean losing our roots, but what it does mean is that we have to meet the culture where it is. What it looks like when that goes right is this. So when the Russians came to Alaska, they started mission work. And so like Bishop Makarios out of Kenya, great saints like St. Innocent, who was then the priest John. Innocent was his name after he was made a bishop after his wife passed away. St. Innocent immediately began, first he began by going into the tribal villages and building things. He said, these people aren't going to listen to me if they're shivering. So he showed them how to make better buildings, how to use better tools, gave them better means. They saw that he cared. Then they were willing to listen to him. He learned, I believe it was 17 local dialects, none of which had writing. So he had to learn it the hard way, create an alphabet, and then translate all the service books into Inuit, Aleut, you name it. Began having local clergy ordained. If you go to Orthodox Alaska now, and it still exists, although after the handoff to America it became less, but it still exists, and you go into one of these native churches, you're still going to see indigenous people. You're going to see some trappings that make it very indigenous. You can still taste a little bit of the Russian flavor in the style of the music, in the polyphonic singing, in the style of iconography, but you'll also see local martyr sayings that are quite clearly Indian. He came in, the very first people to embrace his teaching were the shamans. Here this guy comes in, he's doing beneficial things, he's preaching something to them, he's not forcing them. The shamans are saying, listen to this guy. The very first converts were the shamans. And the people came on board of their own volition. No force was used. And they loved this faith so much that many of them, when the other Western powers started to come in contact with the Orthodox in Alaska, many of them ended up as martyrs. St. Peter the Aleut was a martyr by, unfortunately, these Spaniards in California. There was a boat off the coast. They found him. He wouldn't switch churches. Him and his companions, all of them. Because the faith that had been handed on to him wasn't handed on as something external, as something foreign. It wasn't handed on as a Russian faith. It was quickly made Aleut. So he, as an Aleut, was able to embrace it and grab onto it and hold it. Yeah, their vestments are Russian style. Polyphonic singing is Russian style. But when the Orthodox Aleut prays the liturgy and prays, they're very much his prayers. And yeah, the typicon and the rubric, Russian. The faith, Aleut. It's a beautiful thing. That's what it looks like when it goes right. So you may remember back on Sunday, I mentioned my time in Honduras. They're sort of at that beginning stage. You know, they're just starting to get out there to rub shoulders, to do good work. The problem in our day and age is with the population that's so familiar with other kinds of Christianity, the very real question is, who are you? What's different about you? How are you? So Father Jorge, who's still down there, Father Ignacio, now has his own church, who I mentioned on Sunday, now has his own church back in his native Costa Rica. But Father Jorge, who's still down there, he really does go through great pain to distinguish and not look like the other clergy, not blend in, so that people will ask, kind of like Justin Martyr did, what is it that they have? What is it that these people have that's different than what I've seen before? It's probably a lot easier when you're talking about an Aleut who's seen no kind of Christianity whatsoever, and you have no preconceived notions to overcome. But what's happened is, so they're still very much at that beginning stage. He's gone a long way in that all of his services are done in Spanish. He really doesn't use any Arabic in church, even though his community is Arab-based. So again, all of the orphans at the orphanage, the kids at the school are from the neighborhood, they're all Honduran. He's trying to make it a very Honduran church. But yeah, the style, the flavor, very much Palestinian. The faith, the language, Honduran. It's a beautiful thing. What are some of the ways that could look like for us? So I mentioned coming down a little further south. I think where Orthodoxy comes into play, especially in the southern hemisphere, is you're starting to look at the very real issue of concrete answers to actual problems. And by actual problems, I don't mean problems that you may consider problems. I mean problems that touch the heart that they consider problems. So right before Presbyterian and I went to the seminary, we were down visiting her family. And of course, so way before we had kids, we were newlyweds. And one of her sister's friends was over, and they had a little boy. And he said, we're going to be taking him to the curandero. I said, why are you taking the curandera? It was a female, not female. Curandera. And he said, well, someone's put the evil eye on him, we want to get it off. I said, go to your priest. They said, well, the Catholic Church doesn't recognize the evil eye. They won't do anything for us, but I know something's wrong and I need something done. That is the underlying issue when you're talking to an indigenous population. I know something's wrong and I need something done. Who's going to do it? That's also the issue when you're talking to a population indigenous to Rochester, indigenous to Buffalo. Everyone has that problem. There's something wrong. Who's going to help? Well, the curandera will cleanse him of the evil eye, and no one else is going to help. I said, you know, this church I belong to that you've never heard of, this Orthodox church, has a prayer for that our priest will do. I wasn't a priest yet, unfortunately. And it's the first thing out of his mouth, could you translate it for me? For the first time, for this very real metaphysical concern, whether you believe in it here or not, very real to them. For the first time, someone offered them a solution that was rooted in Christ and was inside the church, not outside of it. I think one of the most effective ways to do that is not only to look at the problems that have to be solved, but also look at the cultural tendencies. So looking at my own cultural tendencies, Latino culture, we don't think about it as Latinos, but Latino culture is very much rooted in shamanism. Shamanism of the indigenous tribes, the shamanism of the African tribes. That actually made it easier for the Russians to missionize the indigenous peoples. Tribes practicing shamanism already speak the language of ritual. So even though they didn't know Church Slavonic, they got ritual. They had enough ritual in their lives that they were looking at this and saying, we kind of get a feel for sort of what's going on. The ritual action was actually the common touching point. So as they missionized across Siberia, that was an easy door in. That was the tendency. For us, when you're looking at a Latin culture, that tendency from that basis is to want to see God everywhere, is want to see God and the saints everywhere, readily available, reliable, quick to help. That's why we do things. That's why we do things that people laugh at, like thinking we see the Virgin Mary on a tortilla. Even we laugh about it. Even as Latinos, we laugh about it. And I'm not saying that we need to see the Virgin Mary on a tortilla, but what I am saying that the tendency is there to not just think that God could pop up anywhere, but expect Him to. To expect to encounter the divine. So much so that even the most mundane object of your everyday use becomes a possible meeting place with the Almighty. That's a very Orthodox sentiment. The beginning of that great prayer, O Heavenly King, O pandahu paron que tapanda pliron, present in all places and filling all things. The only prayer we have to the Holy Spirit, that's how it ends. Heavenly King, the comfort of the Spirit of truth, present in all places, filling all things. And here you have a culture that expects Him to pop up everywhere. That's a great place to start. So if you're trying to mission, if you're trying to evangelize a population, I think the takeaway lessons here are this. First of all, you start with the hard work. You get shoulder to shoulders with people. You get your hands dirty. You help take care of their needs. That's also in St. James' epistle, where he says, if you see that your brother is hungry, and you say to him, peace be upon you, but you give him nothing to eat, what good is your peace to him? First give him something to eat, then let your peace rest upon him. That's in the Bible. That's St. James. That's what St. Innocent of Alaska did. Then you look at the concerns. What problems are they trying to solve? And you look at the tendencies. Where are they expecting to meet God? We live in a thoroughly re-paganized culture. It's not going away. That attitude that Tertullian has of what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem only works if we plan to wall ourselves into this building. But the thrust of the gospel is outward, and so what are the questions that our city is asking? What are their tendencies? What problems are they trying to solve? Missionizing, evangelizing the Kikuyu of Kenya. That sounds foreign to us, but for the people on the ground, it's local. For the people doing it, it's local. For a parish on the ground here in Rochester, it's local. What are those questions within your own families? And then we have to have a serious dialogue and ask and say, what can be baptized? What can be taken up? What can be fulfilled? And yes, what can't? Because there are some things that are just not going to be usable. While we can use some of Plato and his Logos language, we discard the parts that talk about Zeus. We don't use all of Plato, but the church has quoted him. So, what will it look like? Here's the problem. This is really the problem. There's no top-down answer from this. Because Orthodoxy makes itself local and indigenous, it's not enforced from the top down, it comes from the grassroots up. That means all of you have to become the subject matter experts that everyone you meet sees. The hallmark of orthodoxy in their lives is you. It's not me. They don't know me. And I can only meet some of them, but all of them know you. You are the missionary text that they're reading. You are the gospel that they will see. What is orthodoxy? Well, look in the mirror. To everyone you know, that's what it is, you. However, all of these things we can say about when missions go right and missions go wrong, it's all centuries after the fact. We look back at Tertullian and say, well, the guy died a heretic, but that's after the fact. We look back at St. Justin Martyr and say the guy said that's after the fact. On the ground, when it's happening, you get to St. Basil, St. John Chrysostom, and that whole line, centuries and centuries of fighting over what to do with pagan learning is occurring. Centuries. Not weeks, not months. And so that's really the challenge. Expect that mission work will be messy. Expect to make mistakes. There's trial, there's error. And so the other thing that we have to know is what's non-negotiable. What are the points of faith? What does the creed say? What do the canons say? Why do they say it? And what does the continuous tradition of the church hand down? So that we know when we bump into those non-negotiable items where the borders are that we don't cross. And those borders are important not to hem us in or block us out, but to mark us as distinct to the world and say this in fact is who, not just I, we are. And you can define us because we can be known. That's the challenge. I don't expect to see it finished in my lifetime or yours. Nevertheless, it is what's before us in every age. So now I would like to open this up to questions from you.